weekend, there was a forecast. And it was supposed to be a rainy, cold weekend. There was thunderstorm warnings, and instead we got sunshine. My mom is terrified of thunderstorms. She's a storm watcher. She's, quite frankly, afraid of every storm. It doesn't matter if it's a hurricane down in Florida, she's frightened. She hates them. Maybe it's because when we were growing up, there was several times I remember our house was struck by lightning when we lived in Saskatchewan. And one time it struck we used to have these phone boxes on the outside of the house, and it struck that phone box and it blew our phone in the house right across the kitchen. Nonetheless, she really didn't like thunderstorms. And to this day, if it starts getting hot and it's muggy like it was these last few weeks, she is worried all the time. And I think we're going to have to get rid of her weather channel.
Yeah.
Because there is a possible tornado warning anywhere in Western Canada. She is frightened until she can call us and warn us. Luckily, she did not pass that fear of storms on to her children or her grandchildren. Little Ella loves to watch the lightning and enjoys a good thunderstorm. How about you?
No, I don't like it.
The point I'd like to make of all that is that storms are real. There are real storms in a person's life. Fear is real. Our weaknesses are real. The threat is real. There are many things that happen in our lives that are worthy of being afraid of. Don't you agree? They're real. But, and here is the point of the morning, so is Jesus. But so is faith, so is hope, so is strength in weakness, so is joy in the midst of sadness and hardship. Abundant life in Christ is not just a theory, it's real. It's not just a theory. God is real. Faith actually works if you're willing to work it. The grace available to us in knowing Jesus Christ is real. His power is manifest in our weakness. When we finally surrender and lean on Him and rely on His strength in our lives, it is sufficient. It is enough. He is able. That is a spiritual truth you can take to the bank. It is rock solid. And it's something you can trust on, and you can build your life upon that truth. Now let me be perfectly clear. This is not a call to grin and bear it, to wallow in our weakness. It is not a call to have a pity party or to welcome insults or illness or some unforeseen calamity just for the sake of suffering. That's not what Paul is talking about. If someone you love has cancer, or if you are struggling with chronic pain or a debilitating illness, or if you lose your job, or if someone dear to you dies, no one is asking or expecting you to accept these horrible things as a blessed gift from God. This is not about resignation, but rather it is about hope. It is about realizing that we serve a God who shares our burdens, about discovering what it means to be in the grips of His grace and the power of the Lord Jesus Christ, which is far, far beyond our own. Paul does not offer an escape route from the difficulties of life, but rather speaks of a way of dwelling with Christ in the midst of them. God will only work through us when we let Him. When we give Him permission, when we reach out and ask Him to help. We tend to only ask for help when we run out of all other possible options. When we realize that we cannot deal with the problem with our own strength on our own, because we're fiercely independent. And if we think we can do it, we do it. But Paul tells us that there is a better way, a more victorious way. And he invites us this morning to enter into that way of living. It seems like we're programmed to find our strength in our security. not in our weaknesses. Every time we forget that Christ's grace is sufficient, every time we seek security in the world first, rather than allowing Christ to be our security, we deny that his grace is sufficient. But the good news of the cross is that Jesus took humanity, human vulnerability at its most extreme. He took the cruel crucifixion and he turned it into grace. He turned it into strength. He turned crucifixion into resurrected life. And the good news of the cross is encapsulated in this truth from Paul this morning. For when I am weak, then I am strong. That is something that as Christians we should boast about. The question is, how do we get there? Isn't that it? The first point that will pop up there this morning is this: how do we move from fear to faith? We know that's what's asked of us. How do we do it? From self-sufficiency. How do we move from self-sufficiency to dependency upon God? How do we move from head knowledge to application? Where do we go from here? It's a deeply personal question that we all have to struggle with, but it can also be applied to us as a church right now. We have been in a call process for several years. We've encountered a few storms along the way, and we want some assurance that there's some way forward. There is this awesome story about Jesus and his disciples in that terrible storm. And I read it at the head of the service, but I'm going to read it one more time and just point out a few words here about Jesus calming the storm. That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let's go over to the other side." Gives them an invitation, doesn't he? And leaving the crowds behind, they took him along just as he was. Well, we'll discuss that later, but isn't that interesting? He invites them and they take him just as he was. There were also other boats with them, and a furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was at the stern sleeping. The disciples woke him and said, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" And he got up, rebuked the wind and the waves. "Quiet, be still," he said. And then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. And he said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" And they were terrified. And they asked, "Who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him?" You see, the journey from fear to faith, from relying on our own limited strength to allowing God to work through us in our weaknesses, begins by accepting an invitation from Jesus. Begins when we follow that, accept that call, let's go to the other side. Jesus is constantly inviting us. He's asking you and me this morning to go with him to the other side, to go with him to someplace unknown, someplace unfamiliar, possibly someplace unsafe. I don't know what the other side looks like for you. It's going to be different for every one of us, isn't it? What are our weaknesses? For some, it might be accepting the challenge to be equipped in how to share your story and how to lead people to Christ. It's a scary thing. It's an unknown thing. For others, it might be a call to a deeper commitment in prayer life or to studying the Word of God. For some, it might be a change in a life change, a career change. It may involve trusting the Lord to provide in areas that you don't see possible. I don't know what it is. You see, we're all landlubbers. We don't like getting in that little boat. But Jesus is inviting us. He's inviting you to get in the boat with him and go to the other side. It's not easy because we don't know what to expect. We don't know what's waiting for us on the other side. The disciples did not know that when they crossed over that lake, that the first thing they were going to run head on into was what? A demon-possessed man. And that Jesus was going to have to cast out this whole legion of demons, and he casts them into this herd of pigs, and they run off a cliff, and because of that, they get in trouble with the villagers. They didn't know that. There are terrible storms in life. They didn't know the storm was going to meet them on that water. But they went anyway. Jesus is inviting you to go to the other side. The question is, are you willing to accept his invitation? If you are, then the first step is, you'll notice right in this story, is it says the first thing they did was they had to leave something behind. In this case, they left the crowds behind, it says. And earlier on in the gospel, you'll see that they left their fishing boats behind. They left their careers behind. They left their security behind. You cannot take everything with you into this little boat. I know we have families that have, we've all seen or in the process, we've seen our parents have to move from houses to condos to tiny little care homes. And every time they move, they have to leave more behind. You cannot take everything with you. What do you need to leave behind in order to grow spiritually? If you're honest with yourself, you probably know what that is. Could be your organized schedule. It could be a peer group or someone or something that is a bad influence of your life. It could be an attitude or a misconception about what living for Jesus is all about. Only you know for sure, again, but the question is, are you willing to leave it behind? If you are, then take a close look at what happened next in the story. The text says that they took Jesus with them just as he was. When I read that, I thought, what, was he not dressed appropriately for the occasion? Or why did they take him just as he was? I think there's two important things we can learn from that statement about how to move from fear to faith. How to move to experience God's grace and strength in our weakness. And the first is you don't go anywhere without Jesus. They took him with them. Don't forget about him when you're on your holidays. He's far more important than your credit cards. Don't leave home without him. And secondly, take Jesus as he is, which I believe means you don't try to change him to be more like you would want him to be, to agree with you, to be conformed to your expectations, to bow to your will so that your will is done, not his will. Don't try to pick and choose the parts of Christianity, the parts of what Jesus taught that you like, and disregard the parts you don't like. You don't have that choice. You take Jesus as he is. You must be willing to accept Jesus just as he is. And if you've read the Gospels, Jesus had some pretty tough things to teach and to say. And not only must you be able to take him as he is, you must accept Jesus for who he is. See, they said, who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? Jesus is the Almighty God, the creator and the sustainer of all things. He holds all things together by the power of his will, by the power of his word. Tell me, is there anything that the Lord of everything cannot do? Is there any limit to his power? Is there any limit to his wisdom or his knowledge? Of course not. He can do all things. He laid the foundations of the earth. He is the beginning and the end. He created everything out of nothing. He cannot be tricked. He can't be manipulated. He's never confused. He's never at a point in a difficult situation where he's wondering, whoa, I wonder what I should do next. He doesn't have that problem. He's all-powerful. He's all-knowing. He's everlasting. Have you accepted Jesus Christ for who he truly is? You see, when the storms first came up, I'm sure the disciples were not concerned at all. At least 4 of them were career fishermen. I bet you they'd been caught out in sudden squalls out on the lake hundreds of times before. They knew what to do. They weren't worried. They had skills. They had experience. I bet they thought they could handle it on their own. In fact, they seem to have forgotten about Jesus and where he was altogether. The fact that he was asleep at the bottom of the boat, it didn't enter their minds that he could have drowned, since the boat was supposedly almost swamped with water already. And he's laying on the bottom. The question is, are we not guilty of that same thing almost every day? Who here this morning doesn't have a storm raging somewhere in their life? And when the storm hits, is your natural instinct to start bailing water like a crazy person, or to turn to Jesus? It's a simple question, not always comfortable to answer. You see, this beautiful hymn seems to make it sound so easy. It says, turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will turn strangely dim in the light of his his glory and grace. And it is true. His grace is sufficient. His power is made perfect in weakness. But it does take some commitment and practice, doesn't it? It is so easy to forget who we have in the boat. But the story is not over. You see, the disciples finally do remember. And when they're overwhelmed by their circumstance, when they think they are going to die, they finally remember, oh, wow, we have Jesus with us. And they call out to him. They wake him up. And they say, don't you care if we drown? How could you not see what's happening here? Where are you when we need you, Jesus? Don't you care about us? Don't you care about me, Jesus? And Jesus got up and rebuked the wind and the waves. Quiet, be still, he said, and they obeyed him, and it was calm. Then Jesus said to his disciples, why are you so afraid? That is the question, right? That is the question. Why are we so afraid? Do you still have no faith, he asked, and the disciples went from being afraid to being terrified. Who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? The disciples were afraid of the wind and the waves, but they were even more afraid, more terrified of the power of the living God working in their lives. And are we any different? We are afraid that the storms we encounter may destroy our fragile lives or our church or our marriage or whatever it is, you name it. We fear rejection. We fear failure and illness. We fear death. The list is endless. But we are also afraid to let the power of God free to work in our lives. Notice that the disciples never, in this story, they never pull themselves together. They don't suddenly discover some untapped inner resource they did not know they had to conquer the storm and save themselves. It was Jesus that calmed the storm. It's important to notice that Jesus never said that there was nothing to be afraid of. The storm was real. The danger in this circumstance was real. Jesus did not think that the disciples were cowards. They had an excellent reason to fear for their lives. The question he had was, why didn't they come to him first? Why didn't they trust in Jesus first? You see, storms exist. They threaten our lives. They're fearsome to face on our own, but we're not alone. Jesus is there, and he's asking you, why are you afraid? Have you still no faith? The secret to finding your strength in the Lord, to experiencing strength in the midst of weakness and joy, in the midst of pain and hope and peace, in the midst of circumstances entirely out of your control, is to know the source of your strength, the source of your hope, the source of your peace very, very well. That doesn't happen overnight. We need to instinctively learn to call on Jesus. To reach out to the only one who is truly able to help us, to acknowledge who he is and to ask him to help. We need to admit our weaknesses and acknowledge that we need him in our life in every situation because we are unable to handle it on our own. And finally, we need to trust in him. To have faith that he is able to calm the storms in our lives and that he's willing to walk with us through all of them. Are you ready? Are you ready to make that commitment as we gather around the table? Are you ready to come down completely on the side of faith? If you look at the story, the disciples weren't. They weren't ready. They were terrified. But you know what? That was okay with Jesus Christ. It was okay that they were terrified. He knew that they would come around eventually, and he knows you will too. He had faith in them, and he has faith in you. What are the storms in your life? What is the greatest weakness that God is patiently waiting to turn into strength? If you just turn it over to him. Is it possible that the time is right today to turn it over to Jesus Christ? Because his grace is sufficient. His power is made perfect in our weakness. That is what walking by faith and following Christ is all about. Are you ready to get in the boat and to cross over to the other side? There's this wonderful prayer that I'd like to conclude this message with from Brennan Manning. And if you listen carefully, it is a challenging prayer. May all your expectations be frustrated. May all your plans be thwarted. May all your desires be withered into nothingness, that you may experience the powerlessness and poverty of a child and sing and dance in the love of God, who is Father, Son, and Spirit, whose power is made perfect only in our weakness.